often feel guilty, but you're not sure what you're guilty about? It's just this feeling that overcomes you. You feel guilty resting when you're taking a break, but even when you work like a horse, you feel guilty that you're not working enough. In today's episode, I'll talk about being raised in a household where guilt is like rice, like kanin, often served, and how the American culture amplifies this experience. Are Filipinos truly bilingual? We use the same language at home but speak and love languages foreign to each other, together but separated. Kamusta? I'm Rowan, licensed psychotherapist mom, immigrant twice, first-generation Pinoy raising my mixed Filipino-American children in America. I found that after visiting 500 Filipino homes, I continue to be a student of the culture. In this podcast, we would be seatmates in this beautiful cultural classroom. And by the way, did I tell you I need my kapeng barako straight from Batangas before each class? If you're interested in learning the deep intricacies of the Filipino culture, especially as it merged with American culture, talks about trauma-informed care, and deepening your Filipino relationships across generations, which includes my fave topic, Pinoy love languages, you're in the right place. This episode is brought to you by the course Inner Child Playground 30 Days to Playful Restoration. In this course, you will receive 30 days prompt that is allowing you to have your creative expression, reclaiming the inner child in you. So if you're interested, I invite you to check the links in the show notes. Also, I just want to remind you that you can actually leave a comment, a voicemail, a message to this Filipina therapist. If you just go to your show notes and there's links there, click it, leave a voicemail, or you can email me if you have any topics of interest. I'd really be glad to open and read a message from you. Hi friends, thank you for being here. Here's another episode. Grateful to be here. I'm recording this sometime in November of 2022. I'm hoping if you celebrate the holidays, Thanksgiving, that you had a wonderful celebration. Let's go straight to the point, to our topic today about guilt. What is guilt? And have you felt guilty before? Not that you have felt guilt at all. I'm sure all, if not most of us, have had this feeling. What is guilt? Guilt is this feeling bad for something you did or you didn't do based on your assumption that is influenced by culture, some sort of standard that you should be doing or how you should behave or respond. An example is if you were driving in the streets of Manila and you saw a young kid asking for alms or asking for some few coins, and you were rushing to work and you feel bad for the kid, but then because of you rushing, you just rush through your day and not even give the child the attention. You might feel guilty, and you feel guilty because you might have an assumption that you should help or that you are in a position that is a better position, a more privileged position than the child. So these are all assumptions, right? If you are living elsewhere, different contexts, family context, different cultural contexts, you might embrace a different assumption or standard of behavior. For example, that kids in the streets and giving them alms or offering them some type of monetary help actually rewards the type of behavior. So if you have that type of assumption or standard, you might not feel guilty at all. Guilt is a feeling based on an assumption, a standard where you should have done, but maybe did differently or didn't do at all. Now, there is a difference with shame. Shame is not just feeling bad based on feelings. Oh, shucks, I, passed the kid and I didn't even give the kid, a few coins to get by for the day. Shame is the feeling that you are a bad person for not stopping and giving the kid a few coins to help out. The other one is based on you feel bad. The shame is that you are bad. So often, one way to feel shameful, a child might feel shameful one time. For instance, if a child is trying to cross the street and you scream, they might feel shame. And for me, that's a function of shame. And by you doing that, they feel shame because let's say there's a lot of people around the child, it's in the streets. But then it would stop the child in his or her tracks and then would preserve the harm that they have put themselves in. Now, the difference with being shameful is that it's pervasive. It happens often. So it's either it happens often or when it happens, the intensity is grave, that it leaves an imprint in your psyche or psychologically. So if you are walking in the sand, for instance, if you imagine yourself on the beach, if you are just walking lightly, it's probably you won't leave an imprint, a footprint, if you will, in the sand. But if you are walking really with your weight, now you could see a footprint. So in some ways, I use that as a metaphor for an imprint, a psychological imprint. Now, there is an evolutionary function for the feelings of guilt. And you might be surprised, like, wow, I just know guilt as a bad feeling. It does feel bad to feel guilty, and that's precisely the point. Now, humans are born, compared to other mammals, very dependent on their mother, their caregiver. They're not like calves, baby cows, where they could stumble, a few minutes after being birthed by their mothers, but, slowly they can function. Of course, they would need their mother's help. But humans will die if the mothers leave them, abandon them. So the guilt that mothers may feel for leaving their child has an evolutionary function. Imagine if a mother could just stray away because it's too hard to be a mother or it's too overwhelming. There's a feeling of guilt that overcomes them, and that preserve our evolutionary lineage, if you will. So there is a function for it. Now, guilt induction can come from different sources. It could come from structured religion, right? Being moralistic, good versus bad, hell versus heaven. These are always or usually polarized types of thinking. And talking about going back to the example of how there's an evolutionary function from a cultural archetype when you think about a mother. Even if you Google it now, what images comes up, what pictures comes to mind when you think about a good mother. Wolves are known to be very vicious animals, but mother wolves are very protective of their young. They are very much into their own pact. So other wolves can actually attack other baby wolves. And you will find that the mother protects her baby at all costs. And there are some documentaries that you can watch. I'll try to find the link in the show notes. But imagine, even for wolves, who people might postulate that animals don't have the insight that we humans have, the mother wolf has the insight, to not leave her child behind, the feeling bad that her child might be attacked by another animal or another pack of wolves. And so these are functions of guilt. Another function of guilt is that inflicting harm on others, and this might be fenced by certain spiritual or religious beliefs, such as do unto others what you want others to do unto you, or love your neighbors. So when people know more about these types of value system, it might make them feel guilty if they inflict harm on others, and the belief in karma, right? That what you do unto others, that especially if it's unfavorable, that can haunt you, that could return back in another form, not maybe directly to you, but your next of kin. So these are just a few functions of guilt, okay? The evolutionary function to maintain our lineage as humans, the function of not inflicting harm on others, the function of staying within your group, the function of following certain cultural standards or family traditions. Now let's talk about the dysfunction of guilt. You probably are listening to this podcast episode more about the shadow or the dysfunction of guilt, right? You would be surprised that I mention not that it's the Filipino culture that propels this type of guilt feeling. And of course, that could be an influence based on the religious or some spiritual belief, that could be the case for some people. But I mentioned rather that it's the American culture. I used to believe that too, because often you hear people say, yeah, I feel guilty because my mom, who's an immigrant, worked a couple of jobs, and I feel like, I'm lazy if I'm not busy. But as I learn more, listen more, I'm opening and widening my perspective, and I am just sharing it with you. You feel free to share your thoughts. Now, here's why. I mentioned earlier feeling guilty of resting, right? Rest becomes work. It's more of an effort to rest. In America, there's this notion of productivity, that more is more. Now, it is true that the immigrant starts to learn how to hustle, and that's just for the economic advantage of making ends meet in the beginning, right? But also perhaps for pride, for proving to oneself that certainly it was worth it leaving the motherland. And so the immigrant gets busy. So I acknowledge this part. But there is this whole productivity that you don't often hear as much, or at least it's tempered in the motherland. And it begins because I used to do a lot of home visits with mothers and babies. There was this program called Black Infant Health, and I used to do a lot of house visits. And so I was trained to look for developmental milestone. Is this child who's 2 months old doing this particular developmental milestone, motor skills, at a certain age? Are they able to pick up food from the table, use their fingers, what they call the pincer grasp. And so this is very, I should say, different. And, it might help you to know that I was even a preschool teacher back in the Philippines for about 3.5 years. So I have this experience, this eye of observing children, and reaching the milestone is very American. And you would notice that if children maybe stutters a little bit at 4 or 5 years old, you might get a referral for a speech therapist here in America. Now, in the Philippines, it's not that we take that for granted, but usually the teacher compares with other children. And for sure, one would say that early detection is crucial. And I agree with that. But there is this different feel in America where the educational system or the child development arena is very particular, that the child is doing what she's supposed to be doing, even at a very early age. Now, most children have to be left maybe with a nanny, a caregiver, or the daycare. And at a certain age, let's say it's 2 years old, 3 years old, they need to be potty trained. Something that in the motherland, parents are not usually occupied with. Why? They might have a neighbor if in a more socioeconomic status disadvantage family, for instance. They might have a neighbor to watch the kid, or they might have a yaya, a nanny. And children don't have to go to a daycare. In fact, there's really no full-time daycare so far in the Philippines at this point. It's more like a part-time. And it's usually reserved for what they call officially daycare, for people who could meet, for people who are more in the lower socioeconomic status. Children who can afford might access a preschool instead, which the parents would have to pay out of pocket. Now, it's often that immigrants who learn how to hustle complain, when they go back to the Philippines. Either they might complain, my goodness, life is so good there, right? It's like, que sera, sera, you're taking your time. Because that's the strength of the Filipino. Because when you are in the Philippines, there's a lot of things you cannot control. You cannot control the weather. And it's one of the most storm-visited country in the world. You cannot control the traffic. There's a lot of things. So the nervous system of the Filipinos kind of used to that type of uncertainty. But when the immigrant visits, it's either that's the opinion, oh, it's so nice, it's laid back, slower pace, or they might really embrace the American culture and feel like they want to keep doing things. They want to be able to check the list, the box, if you will, similar to what we do here in America. Now, like I said, children need to be doing something all the time. What's interesting, before I had kids, I had a friend who was also an immigrant, not non-Filipino, but she was so stressed that she was taking her kid, doing extracurricular activities. I'm not used to that because when it's summer, I go to my neighbor's house, I play in the street. So I am, maybe once in a while, my mom would enroll me, but that's like a luxury. And just to give you my socioeconomic status, we are middle class. So, it's not like my mother could not afford it. She could afford it, but it's just not the way she sees things as far as spending your summer. Summer is meant to just be playing, being outside. Now, just going back to that thought that parents, my friend who was stressed out, she told me, I said, well, why do you have to do that? Because this is something new to me. I said, why don't you just choose one thing? And she said, no, when you have children in America, you'll feel the pressure. You'll have to enroll them. You'll have to do something. Do you feel that pressure if you are a parent listening? You may not. I certainly don't. I have thankfully maintained almost a a playful way of raising my children. They do a lot in the home, and I actually homeschool my children. So they're with me 24/7. Of course, I enroll them here and there, but not to the point that I'm exhausted, but actually that they're filled, and I'm also feeling good that they're with other children. Now, so this whole thing about the system, it's very different. Raising children is very different. It's like children don't really get to rest, and if you don't have a relative, you'll have to enroll them. And talking about in America, to an after school program or like a summer school, because parents have to work, they have to make ends meet. This is not the fault of the parent. I'm just stating a difference in the system and why that may influence this feeling of guilt, because you have to be constantly be moving. There's not enough space to contemplate, to even be bored, which children need to even build resilience. The schedule is constantly full. As one reason that the American culture can propagate this feeling of guilt. And sometimes when people are so overwhelmed, guess what happens? They procrastinate. Do you procrastinate? Do you feel like you can't move, or there's so much on your plate, you don't know where to start, or you feel fearful of messing up, you'd rather not start, or start at the very last moment, before you will be penalized for not taking action. Now, there is a researcher by the name of Erin Mayer. She wrote the book called Culture Map. She, I believe, now lives in France, married to a French guy. And she was just telling a story how she has a colleague who's an American who, they were given a little over an hour of lunchtime, and how the French are very comfortable. Maybe they feel maybe they don't have enough lunchtime, and they would chat with friends, call loved ones, drink, enjoy a good meal. And the American colleague feels uncomfortable, feels like it's too much time to just quote and unquote not do anything. So, notice when you go on YouTube how many productivity videos in the West in particular that we have, right? It's like how to schedule, different ways, planner. And don't take me wrong, I think there's value in being organized and scheduling. I might have even mentioned in my other episodes how I like to plan. I'm a bit of a planner, but I see planning as I have control over my planning, and that I could change it, I could be flexible, rather than it controlling me. I think that's two very different things. Now, you can even, I don't know if you heard someone, like especially when people don't know how to rest, that to begin with, to get them used to rest, they have to schedule rest. Have you heard of this? I'm not saying this is a bad idea. Even in my own scheduling, I would put some free time, and I'm not very specific on what I would do. It's just a free time for me. I value it so much. I have to jot it down in my calendar. Now, if you're feeling that there's more to your feelings of guilt, you might want to reach out to a professional. But before we talk about some antidote for guilt, let's take a short break. Please stick around. Diyan ka lang. Again, if you're interested in healing or giving your inner child a second chance to a more playful, more joyful childhood, check out the Inner Child Playground. It's a course that gives you 30 days prompt. Each prompt takes you as little as 10 minutes, but for as long as you like, so you follow your own pace. So check the link in the show notes if you're interested. Now we are back. Now we talk about guilt, the difference of guilt versus shame, how the American culture, the hustle, the bustle, the meeting the developmental milestone of shuffling our kids back and forth to so many different places, making sure their calendars are filled and not giving them space to be bored, to just be. Can really propel this hustling mentality. Now, let's talk about the antidote for guilt. Now, I did mention about calendar. So since that works for a lot of people, I want to start there. So here's the first one. See time as moving, okay? Rather than simply a block of time. In the beginning, it might be helpful to use calendar system where you can move tasks around. So what do I mean by that? Sometimes it's very frustrating for people if they do, I don't know, if you do a per hour, per day task, and when you can't do it on that day, on that hour, you might feel frustrated. So for me, a system that works for me, you can find a system where you could do this similar system, is I use a big board on the wall and I use post-it notes because then I can move it around because it needs to be flexible because we are busy. I'm a mom, I'm a psychotherapist, and you probably are playing so many different roles. So rather than seeing it as a block where if you don't do it, it's like it's done, feels like a dead end, allow it to be able to be moved, like literally and physically. Second, hang out with the guilty. I know this is a little, let me explain myself. In the motherland, even though there's a lot of induction of guilt, because of religion, people can hang out and talk about that they're feeling guilty, which makes them feel less guilty. They learn to be lighthearted about it. So if you say, I feel bad that, I did this, and the person, I did that too, and so it becomes a shared experience. Of course, the negative of this is if you did something that is horrible, is demeaning to other people, and other people have a shared experience, you feel less guilty, which this also happens a lot because of social media. There is an audience, but I am not talking about that. I'm just talking about, dysfunction of guilt, where something you ought not to be guilty about, but there is a moralistic standard. You shouldn't be doing that. But a group, the positive part of that, can make your guilt feel a little tempered by making you feel like, that's very human. I also do that. Another one, listen to this, is lower down your need to please the cultural standard. So lower that down and bump up your need to please your intrinsic standard. So rather than thinking, I shouldn't please other people, that might be hard because you might not admit it, but we are social beings. But instead of saying that, you're reframing that you are doing that less, but then bumping up your need to please your intrinsic standard, the standard for you, first, before the cultural group. It doesn't mean you're putting that on the side, that's not important to you, but you're going to prioritize first, for now, what pleases you intrinsically. Now, another one is to make friends with guilt. Sounds weird? Write a letter to guilt. Like after you listen to this episode, if you feel guilty, guilt has a function. Why you feel guilty, there is a function for that. So you can write a letter to guilt by saying, "Dear guilt, thank you. You could start with thank you and state its function. Thank you for, making me feel guilty. I know, sounds weird, right? Because by you making me feel guilty, I have to stop in my tracks, okay? Then you can also tell it, but I want you to visit me less often because I'm busy doing other things. And if before you stopped me in my tracks and that worked out, I don't want to be stopped in my tracks now because I'm no longer that kid that you need to stop. Now, finally, stay away from too much social media. You're an adult, but if I would have my way, I would really caution you. It's really like a diet. If you want to feed your body healthy, nurturing food, then you try to stay away from unhealthy foods, right? Makes sense? It's the same psychologically. It's not that you can't do social media, but know that it would influence the way you see the world. And so the antidote for guilt, because guilt is about comparing, finding a particular standard, what are you doing or not doing. But if you don't have much of that standard, then it's possible that you would not have the visitation of guilt often. So I hope that's been helpful. Talking about guilt and shame. Let me know what your thoughts are. I so appreciate you for having me in your ears. I appreciate that. Until then, sa uulitin. Again, this is Rowan. Salamat. Bye now.